Here we are in BIDS, and we're going to take a database that we've never deployed before and walk through the deployment process from within BIDS, but we're going to do it step by step. Earlier in this course, every time we deployed our database, we just simply used the deploy command, and a lot of things happened behind the scenes. But this time we're going to break down those steps separately. But before we do, let's take a moment to review the properties and change them as needed for this particular project. Here on the build page, we see the output path, and that output path will become a folder underneath our project folder on the file system. And this is where the AS database file gets created that will store the information that gets deployed to the analysis services server. On the deployment page, we have several options. Because we want to break down our deployment into separate steps, we need to change our processing option from default to do not process. That way, we can decide when we want the processing to occur. Notice here also that we're working with the local host server, and we can change the name of the database here if we need to. It defaults to the name of the project. Now we're ready to continue, but before we do, let's take a moment to look at the file system for this particular project. Here I am where we can see the project SSAS basic process, and we see the various files, the data source view, the dimensions, and the cube file. There is no bin folder currently. So now let's right-click on the project, and instead of using deploy, we're going to select build. Build takes all of these files that we've got here in this project and consolidates them as a single file with an AS database extension. Let's take a look. Returning back to our project folder, we see now we have some additional folders. And in the bin folder, that's the folder that was designated as our output path, we now see a set of files, the most important of which is the SSAS basic process file with an AS database file extension. So if we open up this file, we'll see that it's simply an XML document. It's got our database name here, it's got the data source information, and we can see the first dimension in here. And if we were to scroll through, we would find the other dimensions, such as date, and we'd find the cube information and partition information and the MDX script and everything that represents the definition of our database. All of that has been consolidated into this single file in preparation for moving it to the server. But right now, nothing exists on the server. We need to take the next step for that to happen. And the movement of the AS database file to the server is the deploy step. Now remember, we changed the project properties, so we're not going to process following deployment. All the deployment does is copy our AS database file to the server, and then it unbundles that file into separate database files again. Let's take a look. Here we are looking at the folders for our project. Notice we're in Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, and then the instance name for our analysis server, then the OLAP folder, which contains the data folder, and then we'll have a folder for each database. This is the SSAS Basic Process Database version 0, which represents the first deployment of this particular database. And we can see that it contains a variety of folders. There's a data source folder, various dimension folders, a folder for our cube, and then we can see XML documents. And if we were to compare these documents to the documents in our project folder in Visual Studio, we'll find that they're the same. The difference is these files have a version number, and that's how, when we go to deploy changes, Analysis Services knows which files have changed. Now if we were to open up one of these dimension folders, we'll find that it's currently empty, because at this point we've deployed the solution, but we have not processed it. And processing is when we actually load our structures here with data. Similarly, if we open up the cube, we find that we have two folders, one for each measure group, and then when we drill into the measure group, we can see that we have a folder for a partition, which is the basic structure for each measure group, but it in turn is empty. Again, we need to process our database in order to get data loaded into our cube and dimensions. So let's go back to bids. And so this time we're going to right-click on the project again and select the process option. Now we're going to get into more detail about processing in just a short while, but for now we're going to use the process full option and just click the run button here. And then for each dimension, each attribute and user hierarchy will get processed independently. And as part of that processing, SQL queries are getting executed. And we can actually see those SQL queries here in the process dialog box. And that's how Analysis Services gets the data that it loads into the folders that we have out in the data folder. Now let's go take another look at that folder. Starting with the date dimension, we can see that there are a variety of files here. And if we go back to look at the cube folder, for the reseller sales partition, we'll see that there are indeed many files for the cube as well. The main file here is the fact data file, and we can see that there's a file for aggregation storage as well. And of course, now that we've successfully deployed and processed our database, our cube is now available for browsing, whether we browse here inside of bids or any tools that users can access. And there's our data being read directly from that data folder that we saw for our Analysis Services instance.